A very good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today for the M.N. Srinivas Memorial Lecture. I'm Kriti Kapila. I'm a lecturer in anthropology and law at the King's India Institute, and it is my immense pleasure and privilege to introduce our speaker this evening, Professor Arjun Appadurai. Professor Appadurai is one of the most eminent anthropologists of our times, needless to say. He is the Paulette Goddard Professor of Media, Culture and Communication at the Steinhardt School of Culture, Education and Human Development, New York University. Professor Appadurai has previously held a number of prestigious positions at the universities of Pennsylvania, Chicago, Yale, and New School of Social Research. He, along with the late Carol Breckenridge, was the founder editor of the journal Public Culture and of the Bombay-based cross-disciplinary community-based research collective, Pukar. Capital, cuisine, emotions, consumption, violence, temple and trading floor rituals, biography, and Bombay are just about some of the things Arjun Appadurai has written about. What shapes the world in which we live and what changes it are at the center of much of Appadurai's work. His prescient and groundbreaking scholarship is unparalleled in its ability to combine theoretical innovation, a secure grasp of the political economy, and the sensitivity about its effects at the grassroots. His essays in modernity at large gave us anthropologists some of the key concepts through which to think about the ways in which the world had changed after the collapse of the Berlin Wall. How were we to comprehend theoretically and capture ethnographically the accelerated world of speed, scale, and space-time compression? Lest we became dazzled and distracted by the glamour of the high-octane world of image, velocity, and infinite flows, Appadurai alerted us to our responsibilities as anthropologists and called on us to cultivate a research imagination that guarded against the scholarly neglect of people, spaces, and practices that exist in the blind spot of globalization, or what he called the double apartheid. Thus, in his latest work, Professor Appadurai has gone on to examine the changes in the global condition itself. Unleashed as the futures of the post-perestroika, from the emergent forms of violent nationalisms through evangelical Christianity to the persistence of poverty, Appadurai takes up the familiar and the hidden underbellies of finance capital and its culture of risk. But ultimately, what captivates him is the politics of hope and people's aspirations and anticipations. It is this fascination with people's capacity to change, to aspire, and to engage in an ethics of probability that has an uncanny similarity with M.N. Srinivas's own enduring engagement with social and cultural change. Just like Sanskritization and vote banks, two of key concepts bequeathed to us by M.N. Srinivas as signals of change taking place earlier in the 20th century in India, Professor Appadurai has given us not just prescient explanations for the change that is taking place around us but also has given us concepts and language with which to understand contemporary cultural transformations. But praise and gratitude, we were told by him many years ago, are mode for acknowledging the generosity of the giver, but not all occasions and contexts are appropriate for such expression. And in the hope that this is not one of them, I warmly welcome Professor Appadurai to give us the third M.N. Srinivas Memorial Lecture.
Let me begin by thanking Kriti for that very generous introduction, which sets a standard that I am quite certain this lecture cannot meet by the nature of its generosity, but I'll have to strive to do that. But secondly, to Sunil Khilnani and to the King's India Institute more generally for creating this occasion in the context of a venture that many of us concerned with Indian studies in India and outside India have watched with admiration and with great interest, and it's wonderful for me to be able to catch some of its energies and aspirations now. So thank you to the two of you and to the Institute for this occasion. And thank you all for making the time to come and hear me. Before I begin to read from my text, of course, it's my very great pleasure to remark that I would have been delighted to come and give a talk here anytime, but it's especially an honor to be able to give a lecture in honor of the great Professor M.N. Srinivas, who was a mentor, a model, an example, a guide, and over the years, gradually, somewhat of a friend. I say somewhat because I still see him as a galactic figure, who was very helpful in giving me some guidance going back to my doctoral dissertation, a deservedly forgotten work on worship and conflict in South India. Many people begin my career either with modernity at large or social life of things. I keep reminding people that I was a very grubby, detail-oriented guy. And I remember the first review of the book that was based on that dissertation called it both exhaustive and exhausting. But nevertheless, it's there. And he was my supervisor because my mentor, Vic Turner, knew Professor Srinivas from Manchester and said, well, if you're going to do this work on South Indian temples, about which I know nothing, you can be in no more able hands. And that's when I first met Professor Srinivas, who was already in Bangalore. Subsequent to that, I grew to have a friendship with him in which he throughout was enormously generous, both with advice, with his ideas, and his own example of an anthropological life well lived. So my only concern about today is he is certainly listening, and I'm sure once again it will be very tough to meet the standards he set, not by his criticisms, but by his own work, and it's therefore great also to have Tulsi here, Tulsi Srinivas, another distinguished anthropologist in that lineage. So I'm very grateful for the context, the specific context, to be able to think, try to think about the things that now preoccupy me, insofar as they overlap with Professor Srinivas' own work. I won't try and draw out that analogy or those links at great length, but I hope to those of you who know Professor Srinivas' work, it'll be evident why the topic of today's talk is very much in the line of thought that he, for much of his life, was concerned with. So the talk is called The Ecology of Failure, Reflections on Democracy, Participation, and Development. Quite a grand title, but as with all anthropological talks, it will quickly turn out to be about much less, but we will have some reference to the title, that I can guarantee. So let me launch right in. The evidence we have so far and our general intuitions about the conditions of poverty worldwide together suggest that the efforts of the poor to change their conditions through processes of democratic deliberation have almost always been failures. This seems to hold both for the history of pro-poor legislation in the last century and in the data on small-scale deliberative institutions in practice. There are two ways to understand this failure. One is the view that deliberation is in principle the wrong place to invest our hopes, since all deliberative processes are embedded, defined, and constrained by macro logics of power, law, and market, which do not yield to deliberative interventions. The other is to argue that there is a way to redesign the conditions of deliberation so as to produce more successes than failures on a case-by-case basis, so as to allow a gradual aggregation of successful outcomes for pro-poor policies, allocations, or preferences to emerge. The latter seems to be Sisyphus-like labor, given that we have had almost a half century, perhaps more, of efforts of this type in many parts of the less developed democratic world. And today I want to, inter alia, suggest a third strategy, which is to look at the nature of the failures themselves as a route to incremental success in changing the contextual conditions which currently militate against the voices of the poor. And this strategy requires a detour into some technical regions of the philosophy of language, and so a plea for your patience is in order. I will get back to the general topic of the title. So the first thing I want to talk about is deliberation itself as a kind of problem. The empirical referent here, by the way, is to all sorts of councils and committees and old and new forms through which local level, particularly villages and particularly marginal populations, women, lower caste and so on, have been drawn into one or other kind of deliberative process at very low levels, with the idea being that this will allow more voice. And this is a worldwide effort, and India has particular forms, but they are to be seen in many other places as a approach to changing the conditions of poverty, of inclusion. But deliberation. So there's a general consensus among theorists of democracy, i.e. Western democracy, that deliberation is preferable to aggregation as a model for shaping group preferences in democratic practice. It has also been observed that deliberation may alter individual preferences, thus providing some compatibility between these two modalities of participation. The paucity of detailed descriptions of sustained deliberation, in spite of some very fine examples of close studies of these, gives us the opportunity to consider what might be gained by close examinations of deliberative democracy, and more particularly, what we might learn about poverty and development by so doing. There is considerable evidence that in those large-scale democracies in which poverty remains a massive problem, there is effectively no public sphere in the Habermasian sense. That is, the vast majority, now I turn to India, of India's voting population does not share anything resembling substantive equality with the relatively small minority which controls major allocative decisions, both in the structure of government and in the market. Women, lower castes, and religious cultural minorities constitute a disproportionately large part of those who fall below the poverty line, and these are all groups who have been shown to be silent, occluded, or excluded in most contexts of formal public deliberation. When you look at the studies we do have, and I won't refer to them in detail today, coming out, for example, of the World Bank, on low-level deliberative participatory decision-making among the rural poor in different parts of the world, what emerges, the broad picture that emerges of the ability of the poor to effectively exercise voice in democratic decision-making processes is that problems of elite capture, patronage politics, low literacy, and poor information availability, as well as those of corruption, intimidation, and coercion, are major obstacles in the face of efforts to increase voice for the poor in most democratic societies. As against this discouraging picture, there's some evidence from India of the deep attachment of the poorest of the poor to electoral politics. Mokulika Banerjee's recent work is probably the most detailed example. Of the value of public performances in the political sphere to the development of what I have called a few years ago the capacity to aspire. Of the benefits of the progress in some places of the idea of the right to information, very important in India in recent times, for the rural poor, and their lively engagement in debates about also the right to employment. Nonetheless, there is not sufficient evidence that deliberation is a sufficiently effective feature of democratic politics in societies characterized by mass poverty, and certainly not enough to make it self-evident that it is worthy of endorsement, refinement, and further institutionalization. In light of this dismal assessment, my own at any rate, I think what we need is to build a prior case, not an inductive case, but a prior case, if you wish, a deductive case, for why deliberation has the potential to make a difference in changing what I too, somewhere else, have called the terms of recognition in a dialogue with Charles Taylor, for the poor in the context of development. And this case, in my view, needs to be both normative as well as practical. And this takes me again to why I slowly arrive at some issues about language, and it's a discussion of what I call the problem of context. The primary obstacles to the realization of the normative ideals of the deliberative approach to democratic participation frequently lie in the context, that is, the context of relevant factors outside the deliberative frame. Such contextual factors include the nature of extra-deliberative politics, such as the dependence of participants in the frame on more powerful players for getting resources, in structures of inequality, power, and patronage outside the frame. And it should be noticed here that Professor Srinivas did probably the most path-breaking work in his ideas about dominant caste and so on those frames. The limited access to information of many poor people in regard to vital facts which bear on the matters outside the frame. Likewise, the macro structure of distribution in which actual exchange of views between participants is less relevant than the power of a single key player, frequently representing the state in these deliberations, who is the primary addressee of all arguments and claims. And finally, the general unresponsiveness of factors outside the frame of deliberation, such as caste, class, and gender, again, all things on which Professor Srinivas had a great deal to say, to the outcomes of deliberation within the frame. These considerations overwhelmingly promote the view that internal processes within most relevant deliberative frames, such as village panchayats, for example, in India, do not and cannot significantly affect major distributive outcomes, except at the margins or in exceptional circumstances. In other words, deliberative processes are adversely context-driven and are rarely context-changing or context-shaping events. And before we can consider how to alter the state of affairs in the interests of more inclusive development, I believe we need to pay closer attention to the idea of context itself. And I've said something about this recently in print, but I will presume that that work is not well known, so I'll go through a bit of it. There has been some degree of self-conscious reflection among anthropologists and linguists in recent times about the idea of context. The late Wittgenstein's writings on language and use and language games did much to detach the idea of linguistic meaning from its semantic field alone, and launched a deep interest in language pragmatics in the tradition later of Grice, Austin, Searle, and others working in the broadly Wittgensteinian tradition. It may seem far-fetched to look deeply into the idea of context in linguistic and philosophical discussions for help in the analysis of deliberation and development, but I hope I will convince you that it is not. Context is today, as we all know, a default concept in virtually all those social science fields which are sensitive to the frame in which any action, cultural pattern, or institutional form may be located. Most commentators attribute the concept of framing, rightly, to the work of Irving Goffman and point especially to his 1974 book, Frame Analysis, for this. And he talked about frame to refer to schemes of interpretation, which help people to locate, perceive, identify, and label events, and so on and so forth. Goffman's idea of the frame, to which I will revert, both due to its simplicity and its generality, has had a strange subsequent career in things like decision theory, social movement theory, and media studies. And what concerns us here today is its usefulness as a perspective on the idea of context. In other words, there's a lot else that Goffman flows into. The idea of context is part of the common sense of social science, yet it is usually used uncritically. A more reflective and less commonsensical use of the idea of context is needed for a process such as deliberation, which by definition points to a space or site of discourse which is separated from the ordinary course of life. It is even more relevant to the analysis of poverty, equality, and participation, in which poor people are frequently marginalized not by intra-frame, but by extra-frame factors of the sort I've already mentioned. So here's one quote from a linguistic philosopher about his frustration with the idea of context, and this is the quote. The scope of interactional context is indefinite and infinite because each context is embedded in its own context, that is embedded in its context, and so on. In consequence, the situation of infinite contextual regress follows. Although for researchers this question remains a philosophical quandary, for language users it is much less so because, after all, they are capable of communicating effectively most of the time. So his dilemma is, how do we connect that fact to the fact that we as analysts have a terrible time with this infinite contextualization? This frustration about context, namely the appearance that there's an infinitely regressive Chinese box with no limit, has been remarked by others, such as, for example, the deconstructionist literary critic Jonathan Culler, in a sentence which I keep returning to because it's so packed, aphoristic in the best way. And he says, meaning is context bound, but context is boundless. There you are. Culler makes this remark in a careful argument on behalf of Derrida, who was attacked by John Searle, as some of you may recall, for his critique of Austin's famous discussion of how performatives are to be properly distinguished from constatives. This debate, which seems somewhat distant for the study of the problems of deliberation, exclusion, and poverty, is in fact, I think, quite relevant, insofar as it refers to those speech acts which are neither true nor false, this is now canonic Austin, but which produce effects by virtue of conforming to a set of conventions which surround them in some sort of context, but cannot be read from the words themselves. A famous Austinian example, we all know this, of a performative is the statement of the judge in the context of a marriage in the form, I now pronounce you man and wife, which takes effect, or, in more precise terms, acquires illocutionary force due to its contextual compliance with a series of conventions, such as the legal power of the judge to perform such an action, the serious intention of the man and woman before him, the non-existence of other similar prior unions for the two of them, etc. Austin's idea of illocutionary force has been the subject of much contention in the years since his original formulations, but it is invariably taken to refer to the force attaching to certain kinds of speech acts which cannot be reduced to their referential or truth value. Illocutionary force is what characterizes certain speech acts whose intention is to produce certain effects having not to do with the words used, but with their conventional and contextual understanding by those who are in the relevant context or frame of reference. Most deliberative contexts in which issues of development, equality, and voice are played out in the real world involve conventional ways of speaking which are intended to produce certain effects on the allocation of public resources, often resources in the hands of the near or distant developmental state. Those who are marginal in the distribution of both material and symbolic resources in real-world situations where deliberative procedures are part of the politics of resource allocation are almost always at a disadvantage in what we might call the political economy of felicity, what Austin called felicity. By felicity, Austin meant to indicate that set of contextual preconditions that made it possible for a speech act, such as a performative, to have illocutionary or perlocutionary force. In other words, for it to do something rather than simply say something. Now, the Habermasian model of rational discourse, which is a normative condition for the exchange of views in the public sphere, his equivalent of the imagined space of deliberative discourse, you might say, presumes free actors who are in formally equal positions with respect to the matters at issue. In other words, the Habermasian speaker participates in deliberation with other equals. This equality is both the formal prerequisite and the deepened substantive outcome of rational deliberation in the Habermasian public sphere. And the problematic of global development is precisely the radical absence of these conditions, both in regard to the material disposition of resources among speakers and in regard to the prior disposition of what I have called the terms of recognition. So, in terms of the discursive and material conditions of radical inequality, which are the defining characteristic of those situations that I'm most concerned with here today, it may be argued that the problem of the political economy of felicity, namely that feature of the conventions defining that the probability that a particular speaker's performative argument about some change in the current disposition of resources will succeed, here we come to success, as a performative, is that it will never favor the poor until the very context of conventions about felicity is changed. In short, how can we produce conditions, this is my view of the problem then, how can we produce conditions that favor the possibility that the public arguments, claims, requests, and demands of the poor will have performative purchase? This amounts to increasing the probability that they will be able to change the context rather than merely to comply with it. So minimal felicity will not do. There has to be something stronger. In other words, under what conditions can the conventions surrounding felicity be framed so as to encourage context change rather than mere context compliance or context legibility? I hear what you're saying, in other words, or as we say colloquially, I hear you. Put yet another way, can we pursue the objective of producing conditions in which the felicity of certain requests or demands consists not of their relative compliance with the conventions that define the relevant context, but of their potential to change the conditions which define the context? So now, having set this ground, which I hope makes reasonable sense so far, I want to talk about failed performatives. Since our topic is the ecology of failure, and since I've already claimed or argued that the record of developmental intervention in poverty and inequality is one, prima facie, of millions of failures and a very large aggregate failure, measured any way you like. So the evidence we have so far on the speech forms deployed by the poor and the disadvantaged in context of public deliberation over resource allocation in the context of development is that they are frequently in the form of requests, one of the important forms that the Performative Speech Act can take. This is based on a fair amount of empirical work done by a lot of people, that the main way in which when marginal people come into these deliberative contexts where somebody's there who should be addressed, it's often we need a well, we need a street, so requests are very important. Furthermore, the statements contributed by women, marginal social groups, and the poor are often failed performatives. That is, they are speech acts that fail to have the effects they seek on their addressee, whether we take these addressees to be all the members of these fora, or just the key actors who make the final allocative decisions that are the subject of the request. We need a well, we need a home, we need sanitation, we need more literacy, we need a school, whatever it might be. So while it is not my aim, of course, to make an informed contribution to the technical debates among linguists and philosophers about what we can learn from failed performatives, I would like to observe that what is most interesting about the failure of requests by the poor to change the current disposition of resources through their requests in public deliberations is not that they happen contingently, statistically, and post facto to fail in most instances, but rather that they are generally doomed to fail because of the political economy of the felicity conditions of these statements in their specific context. So let me explain this step, that they are doomed to fail. It's not just they happen to fail and we see that and what do we do now, but they have to fail, so to speak. So the development here, and here is where I go into a little bit of a higher pay grade or altitude than even I'm comfortable at, but I'm pressed to do so. The development of the idea of the failed performative is part of an important line of argument about Austin's ideas that includes such people as Shoshana Feldman, very important textual work on deconstruction, and Judith Butler, who's my main reference point in what do we know about failed performatives in any place, in any regard. And then a few others whom I cite here, but I can't, unfortunately, do in the context of the lecture. This tradition of work, in which Butler looms, and rightly so, seeks to uncover in the space of failure also the logic of irony, subversion, resistance, and creativity. Judith Butler's work is perhaps the best known of these efforts and is based in a form of radical constructivism, especially developed in the context of gender and queer theory and derived in part from the work of Jacques Lacan. This constructivism is used to make the argument that apparently biological forms, such as the gendered body, are in fact embodied constructions produced by the culturally normative repetitions of certain performative actions. Since these performatives rely on established heteronormative conventions, in Butler's argument, they produce installed gendered bodies that are the product of pre-existing scripts which have already been rehearsed. The possibility of failure in performatives, that is utterances, performatives, that is utterances made with language and the body, we can now say, having mentioned Butler, is taken up by Butler and is understood as the, what she calls, this is her phrase, the political promise of the performative. Her argument is that because the performative needs to maintain its conventional power, convention itself has to be reiterated, and in this reiteration, it can be expropriated by the unauthorized usage and thus create new futures. And among her many examples is a great example of the fabled figure of Rosa Parks in the civil rights movement, who, in the context of her seating, and there's a long quote here that I have to summarize, but she says, when Rosa Parks sat in front of the bus, she had no prior right to do so guaranteed by any conventions of the South. And yet, in laying claim to the right for which she had no prior authorization, she endowed a certain authority on the act and began the insurrectionary process for overthrowing those established codes of legitimacy. The question of the that's Butler, using the Rosa Parks example. The question of the infelicitous utterance, the misfire, as it's called in this literature, is also taken up by Shoshana Feldman when she states, and I quote, infelicity or failure is not for Austin an accident of the performative. It is inherent in it, essential to it. In other words, Austin conceives of failure not as external, but as internal to the promise as what actually constitutes it. This is Feldman. So there's some complexity here about what's inside the speech act and what is outside. I would suggest that the approach to the constitutive failure, the heart of Austin's idea of the performative, which is also shared by Shoshana Feldman and Judith Butler, is the most fruitful for my purposes today in imagining the apparently hopeless efforts of the poor to gain voice in public deliberative forums. Notice that for Feldman, whose work unfortunately is much less well known than Butler's, but Butler herself was the first to pay very high tribute to this literary work of Feldman's in this area. Butler picks up on this idea and notice that for Feldman, the possibility of performative failure is inherent to all performatives. It is their structural Achilles heel. Butler picks up on this idea and notices that conventions need to be reiterated in order to retain their power as conventions. But this reiteration opens the door to misfires, to irony, to subversion, and thus to change. In her later work on queer politics, Butler also shows that reiteration is the route by which marginal or subaltern discourses uttered in semi-public alternative settings, such as nightclubs, private homes, etc., can slowly inch their way into the public sphere, where they can become the basis retrospectively for the sort of identity declaration which constitutes coming out at the level of the queer individual and a transformation of the public sphere at the level of the category of queer people in a particular society or polity. In short, today's performative failure can be part of the basis for tomorrow's performative success, since all social conventions require iteration and repeat performance for their ongoing force and credibility. It is this aspect of the failed performative that has the greatest potential, I think, for an optimistic view of the voice of the poor in public deliberative forums in democratic societies. It is evident that many statements by the poor, taken by themselves in single contexts, have no positive effects and may be considered failures. But as they are repeated, rehearsed, and reiterated, does their failure contain the seeds of performative success? And here I want to make a switch to a couple of examples that I won't read in great detail, but which come out of work that I've also written about before on a network with one big node in India, which has to do with housing for the very poor urban populations of the world. And this movement, Slum Dwellers or Shack Dwellers International, now covers, I think, 40 countries, perhaps 20 of which are in the African subcontinent, and many others, mostly in Asia, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, etc., but also in Latin America and more places. A very large network, fascinating in its own right. I studied it mostly in Mumbai, a little bit in India, and then I did travel with members of this group to the Philippines, to South Africa, and to a few other places, also to donor countries like here, England, Holland, and so on, to see there. So this is a work that's gone on for some while, but I want to refer to that work, which is based on a very particular approach to what is called secure tenure, secure housing, but which is centered on savings groups among women in these poor communities, whose savings activity becomes a kind of moral discipline out of which accountability, internal accountability is generated. That becomes a platform for connecting these women's groups with groups of male slum dwellers, and saving slowly becomes a platform for claims on housing, permanent housing, better housing, secure housing, and so forth. This is a very rough sketch of the model. So I want to offer some little vignettes based on this work with this network over roughly the period from 2000, the year 2000, till fairly recently, and I'm still very actively in touch with them, so I try and keep abreast of what they're doing. But one of the things I saw, particularly in South Africa, when Indian groups and South African groups and others got together in very large public events, was the crucial role of performance in the active aesthetic sense of song and dance, involving groups ranging from 20, 30, 40 in a tiny settlement to gatherings at stadiums involving what are called the federations of the urban poor, in this case in South Africa, coming from Durban, coming from Cape Town, coming from Joburg, and from many other small places, arriving in this case in a huge stadium in Durban, which had, during some of these events, 20, 30, 40,000 people. And very crucially, these were places in which public address was going on. That is, address in the Austinian sense, request-type address to very thoughtfully selected officials, both very local, Durban council members, higher up, ministers or quasi-ministers of housing in South Africa, key guests, equivalent figures from, for example, the Philippines, Thailand, India, and so on. So a whole range of officialdom, a certain number of funders who are in a kind of intermediate role, because they're not the direct object of the request, because usually the state in some form is, and then the leadership, again multi-leveled, of these federations themselves, which is a transnational formation. And then the grassroots population, which literally would be bussed and trucked in from, in this case, 15 locations in different parts of South Africa and come for these 1, 2, 3-day events. Song and dance, I wish if I were a more astute user of modern media, I would have some great records of these events, but being very much tied to the word, I often forget to do those things and be writing and out talking, so I don't have those things. But I ask you to imagine these very large events in which the crowd would together begin to sing songs, on the one hand, clearly national, like the national anthem, South African anthem, but then also other things having to do with their own movement. But then the key was, both in song and dance, and I've seen this 10 times or 15, to basically encircle and encapsulate the key leaders in the performance, either by forcing them to sing, forcing them to dance, knowing full well, that these were laden with irony, because these people were often, not very competent and, very partially embarrassed and so on, but that was part of the sort of aggressive incorporation of higher levels of power into these performed occasions, in which, of course, there were also speeches and things. But the key moments were these moments that broke out of formal speech into dance and song, but which were not simply performances for the viewers, but they had to somehow get in. And I want to give you one more example of this kind of roping in, which, by the way, has happened to such people as Prince Charles in Mumbai, and so many other distinguished people suddenly found themselves surrounded. And I'll give you one wonderful example of this, and also show you that it works at very small and intimate levels. As, for example, when a Nepali women's slum group comes to Bombay and meets with a very tough group of street-dwelling Bombay slum women in this organization, and go to somebody's house, and they're all specifics to this, but I won't bore you with them, and then it turns out that the Indian women, many of whom are older women who were previously sex workers and are now very crucial in this movement, are much more raunchy and so on than these younger, very shy Nepali women. But again, there has to be a strong negotiation through song and dance about mutual participation, mutual incorporation, and that was a much more egalitarian affair. It was not about requests being made to an outside authority, but it's the same energy that also played out when people in power who were strangers to these organizations, but very important, were drawn in. But I want to give you one example of the way these things worked at the apical level. And I want to point out that they happened in many countries and often in lateral exchanges. So it's not only a device deployed to speak to power, to speak, if you like, performative truth to power, but also done laterally. But in terms of the vertical structure, I want to quickly tell you about an event at the UN about 7 or 8 years ago. Remarkable in many ways, I've written about it a little bit, in which there was one of these huge international UN housing summits. And my friends from India, from South Africa, all were there. Of course, they were even outside the formal NGO sector, so they had no place in the program and all, though they were known, and they knew people inside, from officialdom in South Africa and India and so on and so forth. One of them, by the way, now is a candidate for a Nobel Peace Prize, so these people have carved out a place in some very high circles. But at that time, in this huge meeting in New York, at the headquarters of the UN, thousands of people representing interest groups of every kind, this group was out, but they managed somehow to get official permission, so there's not an insurrectionary act, to build something they're very proud of, which is small model homes, as well as small toilets, which they are very deep into. And I wish I could go more into the subject of the whole movement and the toilet festivals that take place in India when officials are brought to inaugurate community toilets and so on. But the point is the design of safe toilets for communities, multiple sets, in other words, 10, 12, 15, as well as homes, very simple, cheap to build, is a huge part of the internal organizational strategy in India and many other countries now. But for this UN thing, what they somehow did is get permission in a kind of quasi-exhibit to build some of these in the main lobby of the UN. Already a kind of radical act, because the UN guards, of course, are living in Harlem and so on, often black, want to know about these houses. Well, how tall are they? How expensive? How can you build them? And so on and so forth. And everyone who came to the UN saw this little exhibit involving a 2-story house, and then this children's toilet, so some look more closely, some less closely. But at a certain point, I can't tell you much more about it, they managed to get a wonderful woman who's the head of the Habitat, which is the UN housing organization housed in Nairobi, and Kofi Annan, and managed to get them to come to look at the exhibit. But as they came through the exhibit, all of a sudden, there were 50 or 60 of these people surrounding them, singing, dancing, and Mr. Annan and this other distinguished lady, and of course their entourages were entirely encircled, entirely peacefully. So there was no question of coercion, anger, resentment, or anything else. But suddenly they were players in a set of performative actions, which also happened to be performances, over which they had no control, in the eyes of the press, in the eyes of hundreds of other mid-level diplomats circulating in the lobby. And so all of a sudden, the event was completely recentered, completely recaptured, although most of the 300 or 400 people milling around there, including security and so on, had no idea who these people were, but the lady who ran Habitat in Nairobi, as well as Kofi Annan, knew the key leader. So it was not a kind of intimidating event. But they certainly didn't expect that they were suddenly going to enter the script, nor was the script planned. It just happened, as it so often just happens. So there are many other events like this, but I want to go back to my main story here about failure and failed performatives. And maybe the one other thing I should say about these examples is the everyday version of these performances I've described is rallies that occur in places like Mumbai, where, say, someone high up in the housing hierarchy is brought to inaugurate, for example, a small set of new homes that are being given with the keys transferred to these slum dwellers who didn't have previous housing and so on, though typically it's about 20 keys being handed out to a population of about 25,000 there who are still waiting. And that 25,000 represents several million who are also waiting and so on. So these are events you might quickly dismiss as entirely thin, entirely hypocritical and so on. But in them, the politicians are also drawn into these things, and while they think they're working the crowd for their own electoral purposes and so on, what is being extracted from them is promises. So there's an Austinian dimension there. The more you get people to say, well, next year we will have 15,000 houses and so on, this is then built into the next performance. So there's a whole another side, which I can't go into very much, which is not about performative statements from the grassroots constituency, but from politicians who think they're playing the crowd, but are actually drawn to somewhat move the needle. Because all of a sudden the promise structure is inflated. It's higher up, so the demands then get keyed to that level. So the media and everybody else begins to talk about public housing, housing for the poor, with larger numbers, bigger plans, and so on and so forth, which increases the pressure on the allocators. So there are lots of ways this works. But what I want to do now, in order to draw my remarks to a conclusion, which I'll do very quickly, is to say that all of these events and these performatives, which could be regarded easily or dismissed as failed, unless you take the Feldman-Butler line and push it further, because of course, in Feldman's case, the concern is with how texts live through these forms. And in Butler's case, it's a concern with gender and queer communities, largely in the US and largely in very cosmopolitan urban context. So now we're moving out to a very different frame. But I don't think it's simply a matter of stretching the empirics of these models and saying, well, it also applies, with village councils in India or urban slum dwellers in Mumbai or Nairobi. But I think more has to be done. And here I suggest that these kinds of performative events can be seen as a sort of retroactive performative chain in which the bodily performances in which various speech acts are embodied and embedded are rehearsals of an ongoing strategy for binding the addressee to respect a claim, honor a request, or fulfill a promise issuing from the typically poor or disempowered speaker. So the dance in which Kofi Annan and song got involved can be said to have legitimated and even inaugurated the exhibition of the model house and toilet, which was never supposed to happen in the lobby of the UN. If you take this kind of line with other examples that I've alluded to, and I can't for reasons of time do that, I think you can see that it's possible to say that the predicament of those without voice in public fora, those who seem doomed to produce failed performatives, is due to the complete rigidity of the adversarial context and due to the rigidity of the adversarial context, are obliged to cast, this is how I see these poor communities, they are obliged to cast many performative seeds on the ground so as to, if you like, mark the territory of their aspirations. These markings, which are the traces of what appear to be failed performatives, constitute a bodily archive of actions, affects, memories, and desires which can be mobilized by the right emergent conjecture of contextual conditions to yield a performative claim that may be less easy to ignore. What is important here is that from one performative context to another of a particular sort, there is a chain of resemblances. I'm thinking back to polythetic classifications and things like that, which might be called, indeed, polythetic, in the sense that Needham used the term in 1975, in which any two proximate events or experiments may resemble each other closely, but commonalities are not found across the entire chain. Such polythetic classes, which also contain what Wittgenstein famously called family resemblances, are generated by active and steady production of failed performatives, which alter the context incrementally so that the political economy of felicity begins to shift in favor of the poor in the fora of public deliberation. Insofar, and there's something about that insofar that I'll say about in a minute, as these performative chains appear in deliberative contexts, we can regard them as producing deliberative chains, if you like. I use the term deliberative chain to refer to the links between deliberative contexts which are not based in the similarity of successive contexts, but in the similarity, polythetic and incremental, between failed performatives, each of which lays some of the grounds for the next rehearsal, but any of which has the potential to have a frame-changing or context-changing effect because of the mobilized history of apparent prior failures. So retro-performativity, that some of us are going to talk about very seriously now, for various purposes, is very important. It is only in hindsight that both actors and analysts can see the relevant chain. You cannot, as it were, predict and say this kind of statement grammatically is of that type or something like that, as so far as I can see. So I want to conclude with just a few words linking this kind of promise in failures which in a very peculiar way in their juxtaposition over time retrospectively reveal a set of small changes in the frame which then sometimes have a threshold crossing quality or can have that quality. I want to connect this idea, which I hope at least shows in a small way to you already why having recourse to Austin, to Butler, and to some others is not as out of place in a discussion of the public debates and linguistic encounters that are part of deliberative democracy in India and elsewhere. I hope that that at least seems plausible. And I want to link this to some work I did, which is I recently published in a book that came out last year on what I call the capacity to aspire, which those of you who read it will recall is simply an effort to say that poor communities like this and many others set their horizons in terms of negotiating changes in the terms of recognition, partly through a set of practices which works the capacity to aspire, literally as a muscular, energetic system. And my sense is that the working of that capacity, that's what I argued in that context, is part of what being wealthy allows you to do more often. It's like going to the gym or something like that. But when you're poor, that capacity cannot be exercised very often. And my policy recommendation out of that is people of good faith in the development world ought to multiply the occasions for the exercise of the capacity to aspire by disempowered groups, because that itself has changes that navigational capacity and so on and so forth. Here, what I want to say today is that there's some connection I now see between this idea of aspiration and its maldistribution of that capacity, not of any intellectual capacity, but of that capacity, which is maldistributed for all the reasons we can easily see, is connected to this business of failed performatives, because in the exercise of the capacity to aspire, you are frequently going to make performative claims, requests, etc., which fail. They don't work. And it's easy to say, let's move away. And so in street-level urban politics, the answer could be, don't deal with the state. Walk away, just resist. Or become entirely co-opted, simply serve the municipality, something like that. So to not do that, you have to have a view, and my own view is that there's some embodied understanding among the men and women that I've seen in this movement, mainly in India, but also elsewhere, that failed performatives really are not exactly what they seem. So I think there's an embedded theory of the sort that I am trying to articulate about, over time, what this can mean or yield in terms of the main thing, which is changing the context, changing the frame, not just being legible in the frame, as I said at the beginning. Now, two quick comments and then I'll close. One is to say, where I'm now stuck, though I think looking at performative failure thoughtfully, ethnographically, and over time could be very productive, is the practical challenge, which you might also call an epistemological challenge, is you never know which seed performatively cast on the ground is the one that's going to be pregnant with a future change. There's no technology I know for doing that, ethnographic or otherwise. And it is also evident, and this is a painful admission for someone like me to make, is that there are performances that are what we might call utter or terminal failures performatively. Simply doom that door to be closed forever, but not all. How are you going to know in a living ethnographic situation that this thing is a terminal failure? Because you can't advance yourself 20 years later and say, well, of course we know that thing was a dead end. The dead end will only emerge, as it were, after the owl of Minerva has taken off. So there is a serious problem, which any of you who have much more energy than I, analytically or ethnographically, should take up, is there a way to tell when this move with Kofi Annan, as opposed to that move with a municipal official in Mumbai, actually is going to make that little disturbance, Butlerian disturbance in the environment, which is the seed for another move 1 year from now, etc. I haven't solved that problem. But what it has led me to, and this is indeed my last word, and I hope something that Professor Srinivas, who linked the anthropological world and the developmental world of policy in regard to caste, in regard to education, many other areas, will recognize as a serious proposition, is that I am thinking very hard now about failure in general. And I have been, over the last year or two, gradually seeing that about 99% of all human projects are, of course, failures. Most of our personal lives are packed with failure. So we can start there and then go on to all of politics, which seems entirely failures, war, diplomacy, anti-poverty. I mean, the main empirical material of our personal lives and our social experiences, our political projects and our state projects is failure. So there is a reason why we talk of market failure all the time, state failure all the time, this failure all the time, that failure all the time. It's there. But that said, except in the areas of science and technology and by extension business, where there's a whole folk ideology about, well, it's great to fail because then, you know, the venture capitalists pick the success, or you learn through failure. There's a kind of little cliched thing, but it's entirely isolated to the world of innovation in business and in technology. And the only people who more or less see that failure is fabulous is pure science, conjecture, reputation. So even if it's not done exactly that way, you don't have to convince people in natural sciences there's no bad thing to fail. But the further you go from natural science to business, technology, engineering, and then further away to political projects, social projects, personal projects, nobody wants to be in the failure business. It's fairly well bad news. It's bad news. So I'm asking myself the very simple question, can we re-examine failure as not the obverse of success, but as a project or a characterization of much of human life in many societies, and this is a project I'm in the process of building, as a couple of people here today might know, trying to ask the question we anthropologists always ask, but this time about failure, which is how in different places, and times do local discourses, understandings, cosmologies, narratives of failure intersect with globally circulating standards, technical standards, professional standards, failed cities, failed design, failed planning, etc. But we know when these things land somewhere real, they rarely simply win out, and they never meet a vacuum. They meet other conversations about what failure is. But if the more I think about it, when I look around and say, is there a body of work, either ethnographic or theoretical or analytic, more or less based on real life anywhere, which can be a guide to how that mixing occurs, or even of how those things work locally, if you like, without any reference to globally circulating standards. It's a small, very small body of work, and that too involves rereading things written for other reasons in which you can extract this. But so I end by simply saying that I think the study of failure is a very general discursive feature of human life, and perhaps in its difference from misfortune, accident, error, etc., is a peculiarly modern thing. It's a very complicated and specific thing. It's not every accident or every mistake or every error, but it's something which is social, collective, and is a project-like quality which doesn't make it, that we call failures. Could this respond to an engaged ethnographic analysis, to what anthropologists do best, which is something which has a cultural, linguistic, cosmological twist, but recognizing that these things now, alas, always intersect with highly technical, even technocratic discourses about these things, which often conceal the fact that there are a dense set of narratives surrounding failure in human life generally. So that's the larger project, and this paper is just the beginning of what got me in, as it were, out of that Pandora's box into this hornet's nest. So, thank you very much.
Let me begin first by thanking the family of Professor M.N. Srinivas for allowing us to host this lecture. And I'm delighted that Tulsi Srinivas, M.N. Srinivas' daughter, is able to be with us here today. I also want to thank the Royal Anthropological Institute for partnering with us to make this lecture possible. In just the 3 years that we have been holding this lecture, it's certainly become a fixture in the India Institute's calendar. And I think more generally also in the city's intellectual calendar, judging by the audience that we've been able to have on each of these occasions. We established the lecture in memory of M.N. Srinivas, not only because he was one of the exceptional minds and scholars of 20th century Indian intellectual life, but who asked, I think, really fundamental questions about the nature of social change that's been happening in India during his lifetime and ours, but also because he was a public intellectual, working always to inject complex and subtle ideas into the domain of public debate, and to so improve public reasoning and deliberation in India's life. And these, I think, are qualities we seek to honor at the India Institute, and to the extent we can, to emulate them. And certainly they're qualities that very much describe this evening's lecturer. And Arjun, I really wanted to thank you for manifesting all of those qualities, not only in your long career, but also in today's lecture, which I think, very illuminatingly probes this question of the progress of failure, if you like. I can't resist but end with the words of another great public performer, the undecidable lines of another great public performer of our times, who sang, "There's no success like failure, and failure's no success at all." Bob Dylan said that. Thank you very much, Arjun.